They say Catherine Howard's death was swift, a clean blow, a moment of silence after the steel, but what they did to her before that was a slow dismantling of her soul, a calculated process of fear and exposure that began long before the scaffold appeared on the misty horizon of London. If you are fascinated by dark stories, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because, to understand Catherine Howard, you need to walk through cold corridors where the torchlight doesn't warm and whispers way more than chains. Catherine was too young for the world she was thrown into, raised in the noisy and morally lax household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where doors closed too late and vigilance was a neglected ritual. And there she learned early that the female body was currency, risk, and promise. A lesson that didn't come from books, but from the wrong hands and lingering gazes. In a century where female innocence was demanded as an absolute virtue, systematically eroded by the very guardians of that virtue. When she arrived at Henry VIII's court, the atmosphere changed in smell and sound. Heavy tapestries, muffled footsteps, music echoed in gilded halls, and every gesture was observed as if it were a confession. Before any formal accusation, there was isolation, an unwritten but deeply ingrained custom, removing the accused from human contact so that fear could do the work that open violence could not yet do. And Catherine felt this when familiar faces disappeared, when doors were locked from the outside, when silence became a physical presence, pressing on her chest with every breath. They told her that cooperating was an act of mercy, that remembering correctly was a moral obligation, and each word noted by scribes became a piece of a larger mechanism, a bureaucratic ritual that replaced ancient public trials, but maintained the same essential cruelty intact. Catherine was not beaten, not tortured in the classical sense, but she was subjected to something perhaps more effective. The constant exposure of her intimate past, transformed into a document, read aloud by men who spoke of her sexuality as if it were a contaminated object. This was part of a silent custom, the prior humiliation of the fallen woman, so that her future execution would seem not only necessary but morally purifying. Meanwhile, outside the chambers, the court murmured, and the people, always hungry for simple narratives, began to accept the image offered to them, that of the frivolous, corrupting, dangerous queen, because it was easier to believe this than to face the brutality of a system that raised young women and destroyed them with the same speed. While feeling the weight of a guilt that was not only personal but imposed by a society that demanded absolute purity and punished any failure in this fiction with death. The terror came not only from the prospect of execution, but from the gradual realization that the process itself was the true punishment, a forbidden ritual of dehumanization that was rarely described in official accounts because it left no visible marks, only a profound psychological transformation, the passage from person to example, Katerina began to understand this when she overheard almost by chance fragments of conversations about precedents about other women who had gone through something similar. Names whispered as a warning, and she realized there was a pattern, an invisible choreographer repeated whenever power needed to reaffirm itself through the female body. Each day brought a new stage of this process, a new hearing, a new retreat, a new silence. Deep down, there was also the expectation of a specific moment, something that no one clearly explained, but that everyone seemed to await. A secret custom reserved for those condemned for moral treason. A final act before the public sentence. And Catherine felt she was approaching that threshold when she was informed, with cold formality, that she would be led to a different chamber. Far from the interrogation rooms, a space associated not with justice, but with preparation. And as she walked through narrow corridors, listening to the echo of her own footsteps, she sensed that she was about to discover what they really did to a queen before allowing the axe to end the story. What was revealed in that chamber was not an isolated instrument nor a single gesture, but a composite ritual, a sequence of practices, legitimized by the law and morality of the time, designed to reduce Catherine Howard to something less than a queen, and ultimately less than a woman, and the air inside had a bittersweet smell of wax, damp wool, and fresh ink, as if the space itself were being prepared to record an irreversible transformation. She was positioned before a long table where documents lay like profane relics, stamps hung from red ribbons, and each sheet carried not only words, but the symbolic weight of a state asserting itself by crushing the individual. And the men around her did not speak loudly, did not shout, because this was not a popular spectacle. It was a silent administrative rite, where control was exercised through precision. Catherine was instructed to listen and then began the slow, deliberate reading of her own reinterpreted life, episodes from the past, aligned in a strategic, not chronological, but moral order, creating a narrative of progressive corruption that ignored contexts, ages, coercions, because the goal was not to understand but to fix a definitive image. And with each passage read, she felt as if a layer of skin was being removed, exposing something raw and vulnerable to the collective gaze. The sensations were confusing. The cold of the floor rising through the soles of her feet. The heat of her face when old names were pronounced. The vertigo that arose when she realized that private memories had been transformed into public proof. And this was part of the ritual, the total inversion of intimacy. Because in Tudor England, treason was not only an act against the king, but a symbolic pollution of the divine order. And the accused woman needed to be displayed as the source of this pollution. At certain moments, Catherine was interrupted and asked to confirm details, not for defense, but to validate the already written text. And each nod, each murmur of assent, was recorded as a voluntary confession. A legal mechanism that dispensed with physical violence and yet produced complete submission. They were selected witnesses not to guarantee justice, but to ensure men or men who could later say that they were present, that they saw the queen, acknowledge her mistakes, and this gave the process an aura of inevitability, as if destiny were simply being revealed, not constructed. Between readings, objects were presented, letters, fragments of paper, symbols of a now criminalized past, and Catherine avoided touching these items, not by choice but by protocol, because there was a belief that physical contact could reactivate an identity that the ritual intended to erase. The silence between the stages was calculated, long intervals where nothing happened, where she was left alone with the distant sound of footsteps and doors, and in those moments her mind sought refuge in fragmented memories, trying to reconstruct a version of herself that still made sense, while the system worked to dissolve her. This ritual existed because power needed coherence. It needed to show that the execution was not a whim of the king, but the logical conclusion of a proven moral failing, and so every detail. It was repeated, formalized, documented, creating a record so dense that it suffocated any possibility of future doubt. Catherine began to understand that this was not just about her, but about all the women the court needed to symbolically discipline. A silent warning that youth, beauty, and the past were never beyond the reach of punishment. And this understanding deepened the pain, transforming personal fear into a bitter awareness of her involuntary role in maintaining a cruel order. At one point, she was asked to recite an oath, not of loyalty, but of acknowledgement. Carefully chosen words that affirmed she understood the gravity of her actions, and accepted the judgment to come. The recitation was an essential part of the ritual because it transformed the condemnation into something almost sacred, a necessary sacrifice to restore balance. Catherine's voice wavered, not from ignorance of the text, but from the symbolic weight of pronouncing it. And yet she spoke, because open resistance was no longer an option, and the system counted on this final surrender to complete the cycle. When she finished, there was a moment of absolute stillness, a tacit recognition that the transformation was complete. And then the man stepped aside, leaving her alone again, now no longer as an accused queen, but as a confirmed traitor in the eyes of the law. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, a feeling of emptiness, as if something essential had been taken away and replaced by an imposed identity. And that was the true function of the ritual, to produce such a complete internal rupture that the physical execution became almost secondary. Historically, these procedures existed because the Tudor monarchy was constantly threatened by instability, by recent memories of civil wars and every demonstration of control needed to be absolute, especially when it involved the bodies and conduct of women connected to the throne, as fears about succession, legitimacy, and honor were projected onto them, leaving the chamber, escorted by guards who now avoided any sign of respect. Catherine felt that something had irreversibly changed, not only in her legal situation, but in her self-perception. And as she walked back through familiar corridors that now seemed strange, she carried the weight of a ritual that official history would summarize in a few lines, but which had silently consumed her identity. When the final door closed behind her, there was no announcement, no formal declaration, only the inner certainty that the process was over, and that all that remained was the public denouement. Because in that hidden space, far from the eyes of the people, Catherine Howard had already been condemned in a way that no axe could overcome. After that invisible ritual, nothing remained intact in Katerina Howard, and the days that followed were marked by a strange suspension of time, as if the world were merely waiting for her body to reach the fate her mind had already suffered, because the true execution had taken place there in those silent chambers, when her identity had been dismantled, piece by piece, and reorganized to serve the narrative of power. The emotional consequences were immediate and profound, a numbness that alternated with sudden waves of panic, sleepless nights in which every sound seemed like an omen, and moments of painful lucidity in which she understood with frightening clarity that there was no longer room for defense, only for acceptance. Katerina began to speak little, not out of noble resignation, but because words had been transformed into weapons against her. And silence seemed the last territory not yet colonized by the state, a minimal gesture of inner preservation. Legally, the process moved forward with almost automatic speed, because the previous ritual had fulfilled its function, to provide the moral and documentary basis for the sentence. Thus, Parliament approved retroactive laws, something rare and extreme, but possible in a context where the king's will was confused with justice itself, declaring that any woman who concealed a sexual past upon marrying the monarch committed capital treason. This legal distortion was not an accident, but a clear demonstration of how the law could be molded to legitimize decisions. Alre, Imaith, and Catherine, now reduced to an example, became the axis around which the relationship between private morality and public crime was reconfigured. Socially, the effect was equally devastating. Former allies disappeared. Families distanced themselves, and even the name Howard, once powerful, began to be pronounced with caution, as if it carried a contagious stain. Because in Tudor culture, disgrace was hereditary in reputation, even when the guilt was officially individual. Guards watched their movements with cold formality. There were no more insults or threats, only the efficiency of a system that no longer needed to exert pressure, for everything necessary had been internalized. Catherine walked, sat, ate, and prayed like someone who no longer fully belonged to the world of the living. The future as it existed for her had been reduced to a single fixed point, the scaffold, but curiously it was in the past that her mind remained, revisiting banal moments now laden with meaning, trying to identify where her personal history had been captured and rewritten by greater facility. Futile but human attempt to find logic in a relentless machine. When the final day arrived, the public spectacle fulfilled its traditional function. Crowds gathered, murmurs, the sound of footsteps on wood. Catherine behaved with a serenity that many interpreted as dignity, but which was in fact the final result of that hidden ritual, the complete dissociation between the inner self and the body. that was now advancing towards death. The speech she delivered, brief and carefully rehearsed, reflected exactly what was expected: repentance, submission, recognition of the king's authority. Because even her last words needed to reinforce the order that had destroyed her. And the people listened, absorbed, and carried with them the implicit lesson. The social impact of the execution was profound, but selective. It served to reinforce norms, to warn other women of the court, to consolidate male control over the narrative of morality, and at the same time was quickly absorbed into the brutal routine of a reign marked by deaths and falls. Because the repetition of violence creates familiarity, and with it, forgetfulness. Over the years, official history simplified Catherine Howard, transforming her into a caricature. The reckless young woman, the unfaithful wife, deliberately erasing the ritual that preceded her death. Because recognizing this process would require admitting that the system not only punished crimes but manufactured them through institutionalized humiliation. Later accounts focused on the scandal and the sensationalist details, because this diverted attention from the psychological and legal engineering that made it all possible, and so the ritual remained hidden, dissolved into footnotes in vague terms like interrogation or investigation, words that do not capture what actually occurred. This erasure was not accidental. It accompanied a broader cultural transformation. The gradual shift from ritualized and symbolic justice to more bureaucratic and seemingly rational forms of punishment. And for this transition to appear as progress, it was necessary to obscure the brutality of what came before. Catherine Howard thus became a silent turning point, a victim not only of her time but of how the future chose to narrate that time in her story. Was used as a moral warning while her human experience was dismissed as irrelevant. Nevertheless, traces remain in excessively detailed legal records, in contradictions in testimonies, in abrupt changes of tone in document signs, that something more occurred beyond what was officially admitted. And for those who read attentively, these fragments reveal the presence of that forbidden ritual, a choreography of power that needed to operate in the shadows to be effective. The cultural transformation that followed did not eliminate such practices, only refined them, shifting them to less visible forms. But the logic remained: the need to control narratives, to mold identities before destroying. But Catherine Howard was one of the first to fully experience this logic in action. In the end, what remains is not just the image of a decapitated queen, but the unsettling understanding that her death began much earlier, when she was isolated, interrogated, redefined, and emptied. And the axe merely ended a process already completed. To think of Catherine is to acknowledge that history doesn't always kill with blades. Sometimes it kills with words, procedures, and silences, and that is perhaps the most horrific part of everything they did to her before her decapitation.